So James, we all go out and see a lot of customers. What would you say are some of the most frequently asked questions that you come across?
Well, I really think it has to do with the seasonality of it, right? So, in different seasons, I'm going to get different questions. Lately, since we've had some pretty crazy weather here in Texas, the biggest question that I've had is why is the bark, falling off my live oak?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's probably number one. And I have to explain to them, what's happened with the freeze, why this is happening, that the tree's repairing itself, it's creating new wound wood and trying to scab over, because trees, they seal themselves, but they don't heal themselves. If we go back to the drought of last year, we had a lot of sap coming out of trees, so that's probably number two. Why is there all these wet spots on my tree? And, whenever we're going through serious weather conditions like that, the trees are going to be stressed and they're prone to secondary invaders. One of the most common ones being wood borers. So that's definitely number two. And then number three is, why is my tree, looking the way that it does? Why doesn't it look the right color? Or why is it dropping leaves early? And, a lot of times that goes back to what we talked about earlier with the root flare being covered or the tree being overwatered or improperly watered, and then just more of those secondary invaders that are causing it to be stressed when it shouldn't be.
So can you, I get this a lot too, on why is the bark coming off my live oak? Can you kind of describe what's happening there? Because I know we get a lot of calls on that.
So whenever we had that freeze, it was a late freeze. And, especially with the live oaks, since they're deciduous evergreens and, they're pulling up moisture through their vascular tissue, a little bit more so than trees that are, deciduous. It's like sprinkler pipes in your yard. The tree just wasn't ready for it. And where we see a lot of that damage is where the wind direction came from. And so whenever that wind hit that vascular tissue, which just like a sprinkler pipe, expand, contract, and physically destroyed that part of the tree.
And on that vascular tissue, one thing that I come across a lot is people think, on a big tree, a tree that's 2 feet in diameter, they think that entire center of that tree is the vascular tissue. Can you kind of tell me, why the freeze was so damaging and kind of an overview of where that vascular tissue is relative to the overall tree size?
So depending on the type of tree and the type of vascular tissue that it has, only the first few inches around the actual center of the tree is going to be live conducive tissue. And so it's a very thin layer. The center of a lot of trees is actually dead wood. We call it the pith or heartwood.
And dead is in non-functioning, right?
Not non-functioning. Yep. Dead living tissue that
right.
was living tissue at one point. And so it's a very thin layer, and whenever that freeze hit it, there's just the tree literally wasn't ready for it. And so now it just has to go through a process where it has to make that wood again.
And that's what I tell my customers, that, that tissue was dead right after the freeze. That tissue was dead and just sitting there under that old bark. And the reason we're seeing it now is that new bark is healing over, and that's releasing that old bark that was just sitting there for 2 years now. And now it looks worse, but that damage has been there for years.
Yeah, 100%. That's something I hear a lot, where we're still getting calls about it where, hey, I just started seeing this bark falling off my live oak, and I say the same thing. And this has been here. This has been here since February of 2021. What's happening now is, I think especially since we went through that drought and things like that, the trees were kind of concentrated more on living than they were growing. And so we'll probably I think we'll see a lot more of it this spring if the trees, have the right environment to produce enough wood.
So what would be some of your techniques to help that tree recover from the freeze damage?
Well, my biggest concern, what I tell people with depending on how large the wound is how much energy the tree is going to allocate to that wound. I mean, some of these wounds are 2 feet across, 2 feet tall, or all the way up the trunk of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And a tree has a certain amount of energy that it can make. It has a certain capacity, and it doesn't, it can only produce X. So it's having to take that energy and send it to this area, and it's not concentrating on its other functions. So deep root fertilization or trying to make sure the tree has the easiest time finding that energy that it needs to do all those processes, because that's my biggest concern is how much energy does a tree have?
Even more so. So typically live oaks are super vigorous for us here. But now you take a tree that is normally vigorous and you damage it. So that's where, you and I and we all are kind of agreeing on supplementing that nutrition to help maximize and kind of boost that tree's energy, along with preventing opportunistic pests like wood borers. So we would mix in, some insecticide depending on conditions just to help protect that thing until the wound heals over.
Yeah, and that's not something that we typically see a lot on live oaks, but this last year I have,
Mm-hmm.
And so they're definitely under stress. And, the thing that I think a lot of people have to remember is that it's not, especially when it comes to live oaks, they're long-lived trees. And so it's not something that's going to be corrected overnight. It's going to be a multi-year process on some of these trees. And even though the tree looks okay now, just because we're not doing anything for it doesn't mean in 3 years from now it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because each year, if it's having to allocate that energy, it's going to have less and less energy for the following year.
And that's where our fertilizer programs really help boost that thing and help supplement. And the other thing that I tell my customers is, I get called out there and there'll be a pile of bark sitting next to the tree. And I ask, did you pull this off? Well, yeah, I saw it kind of loose. And I tell them, no, don't pull it off. It's kind of like us and a scab on us. When it's ready, that will come off. Don't go pulling on it because that tissue's not fully healed underneath it. And then you're opening up you're opening a wound potentially in that new growth that hasn't hardened off yet. So I tell my customers, just leave it alone. That loose bark, if you touch it and it falls off, that's fine. But don't go pulling or trying to peel any of that away. Just let it work its course, even though it is ugly at times.
Yeah. I think another big issue, especially when we're talking about seasonality and weather, is, and we talked about post oaks earlier, but there's a lot of misinformation out there about something called hypoxylon canker, which is something that we see a lot of, during droughts or periods of excessive moisture. And so that's something that's probably another huge call that I get. What is this stuff, growing on my tree, or why is there this big, large gray or brown mark all the way up my post oak? And, it's a fungal disease that lives on the outside of those trees all the time. And a lot of people, they'll look up on Google or they'll hear from somebody else that, it's something that's going to spread and go throughout all your trees and kill them all. You can't chip it. You have to burn it. Don't burn it near other trees. But it's just not true. Do you have anything to elaborate on that?
I tell them that, yes, it's, it is a fungal disease that is spreadable, but it's already on every tree. If we were to test and try and swab for it, the chances of finding Hypoxylon canker on a post oak property, we would find it on most of the trees, if not all. But it's actually a weak pathogen until certain stress levels are met, and then it takes over the tree. And then that's kind of what we talked about earlier with that final nail in the coffin. Did the hypoxylon canker kill the tree? Well, yes, technically, but it's the years or months of stress prior that let the hypoxylon take over. So the hypoxylon is what killed it, but it's the prior events that we need to focus on for the remaining trees in that area, because prevention is always better than trying to intervene. If you can catch it on a limb of a tree instead of the trunk of a tree, we can remove that limb immediately. We can try some treatments to try and suppress that and hopefully boost that tree's health enough to where it can't take over. But most of the time, by the time I get called out anyways, it's on the lower trunk tissue, and whether the tree's completely dead yet or not, that particular tree is not worth, in a lot of cases, not worth any inputs with plant health care or any of those means. We would focus on the other groups of trees around it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that we keep bringing up the it's a primary stress factor, and then everything else is secondary invader.
Right.
And so you're right. Proactiveness is just really one of the only ways that we can be successful. You talked about weak pathogen, and so that kind of brought up another one that is pretty big in this area that we get a lot of calls about, Ceridium canker. That's something that, especially last year with the drought, or even with the wet springs before, we've seen a lot of especially when it got really hot and dry. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of it has to do with the type of plant that it is. And sometimes it's better just to avoid planting those.
Yeah, mainly on the evergreens, the Italian cypress and some of those other ones. With the Italian cypress, the main problem is we plant those in the total wrong location. We cram them real tight in bed areas, or stick them in a corner, because they grow like these super tight, tall pencils. And the reality is they want to be in fully drained, well open areas, non-irrigated. They want to be basically just abused physically, and we put them in the total opposite. Yeah. And then our customers, we get that call all the time on, well, it's it's in the color bed, or it's in this landscape bed. It gets water all the time, and that's the exact opposite of what that particular tree wants. But because of its growth habit, because it'll fit in a corner, or it'll grow in a 2x2 area, that's where they put them in.
That goes back to what you said earlier. I mean, you can a lot of trees are killed by kindness.
Yeah.
Just
I say we overlove them a lot.
Overlove them. Yep.